In a world where respect is earned through years of service and sacrifice, sometimes the most powerful lesson comes from the most unexpected source. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a young officer whose quiet determination would shake the very foundations of an entire military base.
What happened at that promotion ceremony wasn't just about one moment of confrontation. It was about breaking barriers, challenging assumptions, and discovering that true leadership isn't always about age, experience, or what people expect to see when they look at you.
When Colonel Marcus Webb lunged forward that day, he thought he was protecting protocol.
He had no idea he was about to learn the most humbling lesson of his decorated career. Because sometimes, the person you least expect to be in charge is exactly the person who should be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of Fort Davidson as hundreds of military personnel assembled for the quarterly promotion ceremony. The air buzzed with anticipation, and the crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves mixed with the metallic tang of polished brass. Officers adjusted their dress uniforms while enlisted personnel stood at perfect attention, their boots gleaming like mirrors in the early light. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood near the back of the formation, her small frame almost lost among the sea of uniformed bodies. At 26, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most brilliant tactical analysts the base had ever seen, but her youthful appearance often caused people to mistake her for a new recruit. Today was different, though. Today, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within, even as she maintained her position among the junior officers. Colonel Marcus Webb surveyed the crowd from his position on the reviewing platform. A 30-year veteran with silver temples and a chest full of ribbons, Webb commanded respect wherever he went. His weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the ceremony preparations unfold. He had seen thousands of these ceremonies over the years, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. Young officers received their bars, seasoned veterans earned their next stripe, and everyone went home feeling proud of their service. The base commander, General Patricia Morrison, took her place at the podium. Her presence commanded immediate silence as she adjusted the microphone and surveyed the assembled troops. Morrison was known throughout the military as a no-nonsense leader who had broken through countless barriers during her own rise through the ranks. Her steel-grey hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "Good morning, Fort Davidson," Morrison's voice echoed across the courtyard through the sound system. The response came back as a thunderous chorus, "Good morning, General." As the ceremony began, Webb found his attention drifting to various faces in the crowd. He recognized most of the senior officers, having served alongside many of them for years. His eyes passed over Sarah Chen without recognition, assuming she was just another junior officer waiting for her turn to receive some minor commendation. The first part of the ceremony proceeded smoothly. Sergeant Martinez received his promotion to Staff Sergeant, his wife and children beaming with pride from the family section. Captain Thompson was awarded a commendation for his work in logistics, and Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez earned her Gold Oak Leaves. Each promotion was met with appropriate applause, and Webb found himself settling into the familiar rhythm of military pageantry. Sarah Chen watched the proceedings with keen interest, noting how each officer carried themselves as they approached the podium. She had studied military protocol extensively, not just because it was required, but because she understood that respect for tradition was the foundation upon which military effectiveness was built. Her own moment would come soon enough, and she wanted to be ready. The morning progressed with mechanical precision until General Morrison called for the special recognitions. This was the part of the ceremony where unusual achievements were acknowledged, where the extraordinary was celebrated alongside the routine. Webb straightened in his chair, curious about what surprises might be in store. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, her voice carrying a note of particular significance. "Today we have the honor of recognizing an officer whose contributions to our mission have been nothing short of exceptional. This individual has demonstrated not only technical brilliance, but also the kind of leadership that inspires others to exceed their own expectations." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Special recognitions were rare, and when they happened, they usually involved senior officers who had completed major operations or achieved significant milestones. Webb found himself trying to guess which of his colleagues would be called forward. Morrison continued, her eyes scanning the crowd with obvious satisfaction. "This officer's work in developing new tactical protocols has already been adopted by 3 other installations, and their insights into personnel management have revolutionized how we approach team building and conflict resolution. Their age might surprise you, but their accomplishments speak for themselves." The suspense was building, and Webb noticed that even the usually stoic senior officers were leaning forward with interest. Age was mentioned specifically, which suggested this might be about a particularly young achiever, or perhaps a veteran who is still making significant contributions later in their career. Furthermore, Morrison added, allowing a slight smile to cross her typically serious features, this officer has just completed an advanced leadership program that typically takes 15 years of service to qualify for. They completed it in 7 years with the highest scores in the program's history. Now Webb was genuinely intrigued. He began mentally cataloguing the young officers he knew who might fit this description, but none of them seemed quite right. The advanced leadership program Morrison mentioned was notoriously difficult, with a failure rate approaching 60%. For someone to not only complete it early but achieve record scores was remarkable. Sarah Chen felt her heart rate increase slightly. She knew what was coming next, but the magnitude of the moment still struck her with surprising force. She had worked tirelessly for this recognition, not because she craved attention, but because she wanted to prove that dedication and intelligence could overcome any preconceptions people might have. The general paused for effect, then smiled broadly. Would Lieutenant Sarah Chen please step forward? The reaction was immediate and varied. Some officers clapped enthusiastically, recognizing Sarah's name from various reports and briefings they had received. Others looked around in confusion, trying to identify who had been called. Webb found himself scanning the crowd, expecting to see a tall, imposing figure emerge from the ranks of senior officers. Instead, Sarah Chen stepped out from the back rows, her movements precise and confident despite her obvious youth. As she made her way forward, Webb felt his eyebrows rise in surprise. He had expected someone older, someone who looked more like a traditional military leader. Sarah's appearance challenged every assumption he had made about who deserved special recognition. As Sarah approached the platform, Webb noticed details he had missed before. Her uniform was impeccable, her posture perfect, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of deep intelligence and unwavering determination. Still, she looked so young, almost like a college student playing dress-up in military clothes. The crowd parted respectfully as Sarah made her way to the front. Some of the junior officers smiled with genuine admiration, having worked with her on various projects and witnessed her capabilities firsthand. The senior officers watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, wondering what this young woman could have possibly accomplished to warrant such recognition. General Morrison waited until Sarah reached the platform before continuing. Lieutenant Chen's work has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels of command. Her innovative approaches to tactical analysis have been studied and implemented across multiple branches of service, and her leadership potential has been recognized by senior commanders from coast to coast. Webb found himself reassessing his initial reaction. If Morrison was willing to stake her reputation on this young officer, there had to be more to the story. The general was not known for empty gestures or undeserved praise. Everything she did was calculated and purposeful. As Sarah climbed the steps to the platform, her composure never wavered. She had prepared for this moment, not just in terms of knowing what to expect, but in terms of understanding what it represented. This wasn't just about her personal achievement. It was about proving that the military could recognize talent regardless of age or appearance. Morrison gestured for Sarah to stand beside her at the podium. The contrast between the two women was striking. Morrison with her decades of experience and commanding presence, and Sarah with her youthful energy and quiet confidence. Yet somehow they seemed to complement each other perfectly, representing both the past and the future of military leadership. Lieutenant Chen, Morrison announced, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, has been selected for immediate promotion to captain, effective today. Furthermore, she has been chosen to lead a new initiative that will reshape how we approach tactical planning across all branches of service. The applause was more enthusiastic now, as people began to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. Immediate promotions were extremely rare, typically reserved for combat situations or truly extraordinary circumstances. For Sarah to receive such recognition in peacetime spoke volumes about her abilities. Webb found himself clapping along with the others, though his mind was racing with questions. How had he not heard of this young officer before? What had she done to warrant such unusual recognition? And why did he feel like he was missing something important? As the ceremony continued and Sarah received her new rank insignia, Webb made a mental note to learn more about her background. Something told him that Lieutenant Chen, now Captain Chen, was going to be a force to be reckoned with, regardless of how young she looked. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard as the promotion ceremony moved towards its conclusion. Little did Webb know that his assumptions about rank, age, and authority were about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. The real surprises of the day were just beginning. The ceremony had concluded with the traditional closing remarks, but the buzz of conversation continued as officers and their families mingled in the courtyard. Captain Sarah Chen found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom she had worked with on various projects over the past few years. Their congratulations were genuine, tinged with the kind of respect that comes from having witnessed someone's capabilities firsthand. Colonel Webb remained on the reviewing platform, ostensibly helping to organize the post-ceremony activities, but in reality studying the young captain who had so thoroughly surprised him. He watched as she interacted with both junior and senior personnel, noting how naturally she seemed to command respect without demanding it. There was something about her presence that drew people in, a quality that couldn't be taught in any military academy. Major Jennifer Phillips, Webb's aide-de-camp, approached him with a tablet containing the day's schedule updates. "Sir, there's been a change to this afternoon's briefing. General Morrison wants to move it up to 1400 hours, and she's added Captain Chen to the attendee list." Webb's eyebrows rose slightly. "Chen? That seems unusual for someone who was just promoted this morning." Phillips glanced at her tablet again, then looked up with an expression that suggested she knew something Webb didn't. "Actually, sir, according to the briefing notes, Captain Chen isn't just attending the meeting. She's leading it." The colonel felt a familiar tightness in his chest that usually preceded moments when his worldview was about to be significantly adjusted. Leading it? What exactly is this briefing about? The new tactical integration protocols, sir. The ones that have been under development for the past 18 months. Apparently, Captain Chen was the primary architect of the entire program. Webb was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. He prided himself on staying informed about all major initiatives at Fort Davidson. Yet somehow this young officer had been working on something significant right under his nose without him even knowing about it. The feeling was both humbling and slightly irritating. As if summoned by his thoughts, General Morrison approached with Captain Chen at her side. The general's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was enjoying a private joke. "Colonel Webb," Morrison began, her tone formal but warm, "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to Captain Chen. She's been working on some projects that I think will interest you greatly." Webb extended his hand, noting the firm confidence of Sarah's handshake. "Captain Chen, congratulations on your promotion. I understand you've been busy with some important work." Sarah smiled, and Webb was struck by how her entire demeanor seemed to shift when she was focused on professional matters. The youth that had initially caught his attention was still there, but it was now overshadowed by an obvious competence that commanded respect. "Thank you, Colonel. I've been looking forward to meeting you. I've read several of your papers on personnel management and conflict resolution. Your insights into cross-departmental cooperation were particularly helpful when I was developing the integration protocols." Webb felt another small shock of surprise. Not only was this young woman familiar with his work, but she had apparently used it as a foundation for her own projects. He had written those papers nearly a decade ago, and they were fairly obscure, even within military circles. Morrison seemed to sense his confusion and decided to provide some context. "Marcus, Captain Chen has been working directly under my supervision for the past 2 years. The tactical integration program she developed has already been tested at Fort Benning and Camp Pendleton, with remarkable results. We're looking at a complete overhaul of how multiple units coordinate in complex scenarios." The pieces began falling into place for Webb. He had heard references to new protocols being developed, but the information had always come through official channels with appropriately sanitized details. He had assumed the work was being done by a team of senior analysts, possibly with input from civilian consultants. The idea that a lieutenant, now captain, in her mid-20s, had been the driving force behind such a significant initiative was almost beyond belief. "I'd be very interested to hear more about your work," Webb said, genuinely meaning it. "What inspired you to focus on integration protocols?" Sarah's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from discussing something you're genuinely passionate about. "I noticed that our biggest operational challenges weren't usually about individual unit performance. Most of our people are extremely well trained and capable. The problems arose when multiple units had to work together, especially when they came from different branches or had different operational cultures." Webb nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. Some of his most frustrating experiences had involved exactly those kinds of coordination failures. Sarah continued, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "So I started looking at it from a systems perspective. Instead of trying to force different units to adapt to each other, what if we created flexible protocols that could accommodate different operational styles while still ensuring seamless cooperation? That's a fascinating approach, Webb replied, and he meant it. How did you test the effectiveness of these protocols? Morrison smiled slightly before answering. That's where it gets interesting, Marcus. The tests weren't simulations. Captain Chen convinced me to let her implement the protocols during actual training exercises. The results were so dramatic that other bases started requesting copies of our procedures. Webb felt his respect for the young captain increasing by the minute. Convincing a general to approve experimental protocols during actual exercises required not only technical competence, but also significant political skill and personal credibility. These were qualities that typically took years to develop. The real breakthrough came when we realized that the protocols could be adapted for civilian applications as well, Sarah added. Emergency response coordination, disaster relief operations, even corporate project management. The principles are universal. Webb was beginning to understand why Morrison had been willing to fast-track Sarah's promotion. This wasn't just about military efficiency. It was about fundamental improvements to how complex organizations could function. The implications were staggering. Major Phillips reappeared at Webb's elbow, checking her watch meaningfully. Sir, the briefing begins in 30 minutes. Should I make sure the conference room is prepared? Morrison nodded. Yes, and make sure we have the large display screens available. Captain Chen's presentation includes some complex flowcharts that are easier to understand when they're properly sized. As Phillips hurried away, Webb realized he was looking forward to the briefing with unusual anticipation. It had been years since he had encountered something genuinely new in military methodology, and even longer since he had been surprised by a colleague's capabilities.
Colonel, Sarah said, her tone becoming slightly more formal. I should mention that the briefing will include some recommendations for personnel changes.
Some of the protocol implementations require specific skill sets, and I've identified several officers who would be ideal for key positions. Webb nodded, assuming she was talking about requesting transfers or assignments for junior personnel. Of course. Personnel optimization is always important when implementing new procedures. Morrison's smile grew slightly wider. Actually, Marcus, some of the recommendations involve senior personnel. Captain Chen has some interesting ideas about how experience and innovation can be better integrated. There was something in the general's tone that suggested Webb should pay close attention to this comment, but before he could ask for clarification, they were interrupted by the arrival of several other senior officers who had been summoned for the briefing. Colonel Patricia Santos from the Engineering Division approached with obvious curiosity. Morrison, I have to admit I'm intrigued by this meeting. My aide said it involves some new protocols, but the details were classified above her level. You'll understand the security concerns once you see what Captain Chen has developed, Morrison replied. The applications extend far beyond standard military operations. Lieutenant Colonel David Park from Intelligence joined the group, looking slightly puzzled. I received a priority briefing notice, but I'm not sure why intelligence would be involved in tactical protocols. Sarah spoke up, addressing Park directly. The protocols include significant improvements to information sharing and real-time analysis. Your input on security implications will be crucial if we're going to implement them across multiple installations. Park studied Sarah with obvious interest. He was known for his analytical mind and his ability to spot weaknesses in proposed systems. You've considered the security vulnerabilities of increased information sharing? Extensively, Sarah replied without hesitation. In fact, the protocols actually improve security by creating multiple redundant communication pathways while maintaining strict compartmentalization where necessary. Webb watched this exchange with growing fascination. Sarah was clearly comfortable discussing complex topics with senior officers who had decades more experience than she did. Moreover, she seemed to have anticipated their concerns and prepared responses that demonstrated deep understanding of their respective specialties. As the group began moving toward the briefing room, Morrison fell into step beside Webb. Marcus, I'm curious about your thoughts so far. Webb considered his words carefully. I have to admit, General, that Captain Chen has already exceeded my expectations. Her understanding of organizational dynamics seems remarkably sophisticated for someone her age. That's just the beginning, Morrison replied quietly. Wait until you see what she's actually accomplished. The briefing room was one of the newer additions to Fort Davidson's command complex, equipped with state-of-the-art presentation technology and designed to accommodate both classified and unclassified materials. As the senior officers took their seats around the polished conference table, Webb noticed that Sarah moved to the front of the room with the kind of natural confidence that suggested she was completely comfortable in this environment. Major Phillips distributed folders containing overview materials, while Sarah connected her laptop to the presentation system. Webb glanced through the summary sheets and felt his eyebrows rise again. The scope of what he was reading was far broader than anything he had imagined. "Before we begin," Morrison announced to the room, "I want to emphasize that everything you're about to see is classified at the highest levels. The protocols we're discussing have implications that extend well beyond Fort Davidson, and several other installations are waiting for our recommendations before proceeding with their own implementations." Sarah stepped to the center of the room, her posture confident but not arrogant. "Good afternoon, everyone. What I'm about to show you represents 2 years of intensive research, testing, and refinement. The tactical integration protocols we've developed don't just improve efficiency, they fundamentally change how military units can operate in complex, multifaceted scenarios." She clicked the first slide, and Webb found himself looking at a diagram that was both elegant and incredibly complex. The flowchart showed interconnected systems that seemed to anticipate and accommodate dozens of different operational variables simultaneously. "The traditional approach to multi-unit coordination relies on hierarchical command structures," Sarah continued. "This works well in straightforward situations, but it breaks down when you're dealing with rapidly changing conditions or when units with different specializations need to collaborate in real time." Webb leaned forward, studying the diagram more carefully. He could see immediately that Sarah's approach was radically different from anything he had encountered before. Instead of rigid command chains, the protocols seemed to create flexible networks that could adapt to circumstances while maintaining clear accountability. The key insight, Sarah explained, was recognizing that modern military operations are more like jazz ensembles than orchestras. Everyone needs to know the basic structure, but the real effectiveness comes from the ability to improvise and adapt while staying coordinated with the overall mission. Colonel Santos raised her hand. "This is fascinating in theory, but how do you maintain discipline and accountability in such a flexible system?" Sarah smiled, clearly having anticipated this question. "That's where the protocols become really interesting. Instead of relying solely on hierarchical oversight, we've built accountability directly into the communication systems. Every decision point is logged and tracked, but the decision-making authority is distributed to whoever has the best real-time information." Webb felt a familiar sensation, the one that came when he encountered an idea that was both obviously correct and completely revolutionary. Sarah wasn't just proposing tactical improvements. She was reimagining the fundamental nature of military command and control. As the briefing continued, Webb began to understand that his assumptions about rank, experience, and authority were about to be challenged in ways he had never anticipated. The young captain standing at the front of the room wasn't just presenting new ideas. She was demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that many officers never achieved regardless of their years of service. The real surprises, he realized, were just beginning. As Sarah's presentation continued, Webb found himself completely absorbed in the complexity and elegance of her protocols. Each slide revealed new layers of sophistication, from real-time communication algorithms to adaptive command structures that could reorganize themselves based on changing mission parameters. What struck him most was how practical everything seemed, despite its theoretical complexity. The field tests at Fort Benning demonstrated a 37% improvement in mission completion times, Sarah explained, clicking to a slide filled with statistical data. More importantly, we saw a 62% reduction in coordination errors and a complete elimination of the communication delays that had plagued previous multi-unit operations. Lieutenant Colonel Park leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed despite himself. "Those are remarkable numbers. How did you account for variables like personnel turnover and different training backgrounds?" "That's one of the most important features of the system," Sarah replied, moving to the next slide. "The protocols are designed to be self-teaching. New personnel can be integrated into existing operations within hours rather than weeks, because the system adapts to their capabilities rather than requiring them to adapt to rigid procedures." Colonel Santos shook her head in amazement. "Captain, this isn't just tactical innovation. You're talking about a complete paradigm shift in how we think about military operations." Webb watched Sarah's response to this praise, noting that she neither dismissed it modestly nor accepted it with obvious pride. Instead, she simply nodded acknowledgement and continued with her presentation, displaying the kind of professional maturity that typically took years to develop. "The next phase of implementation will require careful coordination across multiple installations," Sarah continued. We've identified 12 key positions that will need to be filled by officers with specific combinations of technical expertise and leadership experience. Morrison spoke up from her position at the head of the table. This is where things get particularly interesting. Captain Chen's analysis of personnel requirements has led to some unconventional recommendations. Webb felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. Unconventional recommendations from Morrison usually meant that someone's comfortable assumptions were about to be challenged. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which displayed an organizational chart unlike anything Webb had ever seen. Instead of the traditional pyramid structure, it showed a network of interconnected nodes, each representing different specializations and command responsibilities. The traditional approach would be to assign the most senior available officers to leadership positions, Sarah explained. But our analysis suggests that effectiveness in this system depends more on specific skill sets and adaptability than on years of service or previous command experience. Colonel Santos raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting that junior officers might be better suited for some leadership roles than their seniors? In some cases, yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. The system requires leaders who can think in terms of networks rather than hierarchies, who can make decisions based on data rather than precedent, and who can adapt quickly to changing circumstances. These qualities don't necessarily correlate with traditional measures of seniority. Webb felt his pulse quicken. He had spent 30 years building his career on the assumption that experience and rank were the primary qualifications for leadership positions. The idea that a junior officer might be better suited for certain responsibilities was both threatening and intriguing. Let me be specific, Sarah continued, clicking to a slide that showed detailed position requirements. The role of integration coordinator requires someone with advanced training in systems analysis, demonstrated ability to work across traditional command boundaries, and experience with real-time problem-solving under pressure. These qualifications might be found in a captain with the right background just as easily as in a colonel with more traditional experience. Lieutenant Colonel Park nodded slowly. I can see the logic. But how do you maintain respect for rank and chain of command if junior officers are placed in positions of significant authority? Sarah smiled, and Webb noticed that her expression suggested she had not only anticipated this question, but had already solved the problem it represented. The system doesn't eliminate hierarchy. It creates multiple overlapping hierarchies based on expertise and mission requirements. A colonel might report to a captain for technical decisions while maintaining overall command authority for strategic planning. The room fell silent as the implications of the statement sank in. Webb found himself imagining scenarios where his years of experience might be less relevant than someone else's specialized knowledge, and the thought was both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. Morrison decided to move the discussion forward. Captain Chen, why don't you present your specific personnel recommendations? I think it's time for everyone to understand exactly what we're proposing. Sarah nodded and clicked to the next slide. Webb's name appeared at the top of a list, along with several other senior officers from the room. His heart rate increased slightly as he wondered what role she might have in mind for him. Colonel Webb, Sarah began, looking directly at him, your background in personnel management and conflict resolution makes you an ideal candidate for the position of Human Systems Coordinator. This role would involve overseeing the integration of personnel across traditional departmental boundaries and ensuring that the human elements of the system function as smoothly as the technical elements. Webb felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. The position sounded both challenging and important, playing to his established strengths while incorporating them into Sarah's new framework. What would be the reporting structure for this position? That's where things get interesting, Morrison interjected, her expression suggesting that she was about to deliver news that would surprise everyone in the room. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed the complete organizational structure for the new system. Webb scanned the chart quickly, looking for his name and its position relative to others. What he found made him blink hard and look again. According to the chart, the Human Systems Coordinator position reported directly to the Chief Integration Officer, and the Chief Integration Officer was Captain Sarah Chen. Webb stared at the slide, trying to process what he was seeing. According to this organizational structure, he would be reporting to an officer who was not only 20 years younger than him, but also significantly junior in rank. The very idea seemed to violate every principle of military hierarchy he had ever learned. I understand this may seem unconventional, Sarah said, her voice calm but watchful as she observed the reactions around the room. But the effectiveness of the integration protocols depends on having centralized coordination of all systems elements. The Chief Integration Officer needs to have complete authority over protocol implementation, regardless of traditional rank considerations.
Colonel Santos was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled.
Are you suggesting that you would have command authority over officers who significantly outrank you? Within the scope of integration protocol operations, yes.
Sarah replied without hesitation. Just as a flight surgeon can override a general's decisions about medical fitness for duty, or a chaplain can maintain confidentiality even from commanding officers.
This system requires that expertise take precedence over rank in specific circumstances. Webb found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of him was offended by the suggestion that he should report to someone so junior. But another part of him recognized the logical consistency of Sarah's argument. If the protocols were as revolutionary as they appeared to be, perhaps traditional approaches to authority needed to be reconsidered as well. Lieutenant Colonel Park voiced what several people were thinking. This is going to create significant resistance throughout the chain of command. How do you propose to implement such a radical departure from established protocol? Morrison leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. That's exactly why we're having this discussion. The Department of Defense has already approved the basic framework, but successful implementation will require buy-in from senior officers who understand both the potential benefits and the necessary adjustments to traditional procedures. Webb felt a shock of surprise. The Department of Defense has already approved this. 3 weeks ago, Morrison confirmed. Captain Chen presented the protocols to a joint panel including representatives from all service branches. The approval was unanimous, with implementation scheduled to begin here at Fort Davidson within 60 days. The room fell silent again as everyone processed this information. Webb realized that what he had initially assumed was a briefing about proposed changes was actually a notification about decisions that had already been made at the highest levels of command. Sarah seemed to sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. I want to emphasize that these changes aren't about diminishing anyone's contributions or disrespecting the experience that everyone here brings to their positions. The protocols are designed to enhance effectiveness by combining traditional military expertise with new approaches to coordination and communication. Colonel Santos nodded slowly. I can appreciate the logic, Captain, but you have to understand that what you're proposing challenges some very fundamental assumptions about how military organizations function. I understand that completely, Sarah replied. That's why the implementation plan includes extensive training and gradual transition periods. No one will be expected to adapt to these changes overnight. Webb found his voice, though it took some effort to keep his tone neutral. Captain Chen, help me understand something. In your role as Chief Integration Officer, what would be your authority over personnel decisions and operational planning? Sarah clicked to a new slide that outlined the specific responsibilities and limitations of the position. The Chief Integration Officer has authority over protocol implementation and systems coordination, but traditional command authority remains unchanged for all other operational aspects. Think of it as a specialized staff position with broad coordination responsibilities, rather than a traditional command role. Webb studied the chart carefully, noting that the limitations were more significant than he had initially realized. The Chief Integration Officer position was powerful within its specific domain, but it didn't override traditional command structures for most day-to-day operations. So if I understand correctly, Webb said, you would have authority over how the protocols are implemented, but I would retain authority over personnel management and standard operational procedures within my area of responsibility?
Exactly, Sarah confirmed.
Goal is coordination and integration, not replacement of existing command structures. Morrison stood up, signaling that the formal presentation was concluding. Gentlemen, lady, I need your initial reactions and any immediate concerns. We have 2 weeks to finalize our implementation plan, and your input is crucial for ensuring success. Colonel Santos was the first to respond. General, I have to admit that Captain Chen's work is impressive, and the potential benefits are obvious. My concern is about the practical aspects of implementation. How do we maintain morale and discipline when junior officers are placed in positions of significant authority over their seniors? Lieutenant Colonel Park nodded in agreement. That's my primary concern as well. The protocols themselves seem sound, but the organizational implications could be destabilizing if not handled carefully. Webb found himself in the unexpected position of defending Sarah's proposals. Actually, I think Captain Chen has addressed those concerns more thoroughly than we might initially assume. The authority structures she's proposing are limited in scope and based on expertise rather than arbitrary reversals of hierarchy. Sarah looked at him with obvious surprise and gratitude. Thank you, Colonel. That's exactly the principle we're trying to establish. Morrison smiled with satisfaction. Marcus, I'm pleased to hear that perspective from you. Your support will be crucial for successful implementation. As the meeting began to wind down, Webb realized that his initial skepticism had been replaced by cautious optimism.
Sarah's protocols represented a genuine innovation in military organization, and her approach to implementation seemed both thoughtful and respectful of existing structures. But he also knew that the real test would come when these theoretical frameworks met the practical realities of military culture and individual personalities. The protocols might be brilliant, but their success would ultimately depend on whether people like him could adapt to working under the authority of someone like Captain Sarah Chen. As he gathered his materials and prepared to leave the briefing room, Webb caught Sarah's eye. "Captain, I'd like to schedule some time to discuss the specifics of the Human Systems Coordinator position. I have some ideas that might help with the implementation process." Sarah's smile was genuine and grateful. "I'd welcome that discussion, Colonel. Your experience will be invaluable for making these protocols work in practice." Webb nodded and headed for the door, his mind already working through the implications of what he had just learned. The morning's promotion ceremony seemed like a lifetime ago, and he suspected that the real challenges and opportunities were just beginning to reveal themselves. 3 weeks later, the implementation of Sarah's protocols had begun in earnest. The transition period had been more challenging than anyone anticipated, with daily briefings, training sessions, and constant adjustments to existing procedures. Webb found himself working more closely with Sarah than he had with any colleague in years, and despite his initial reservations, he was beginning to appreciate both her intelligence and her diplomatic skills. The morning of the incident began like any other. Webb arrived at his office to find a stack of reports related to the protocol implementation, along with a note from Sarah requesting a meeting to discuss some personnel adjustments. As he reviewed the materials, he was struck again by the thoroughness of her analysis and the practical wisdom of her recommendations. Major Phillips knocked on his doorframe. "Sir, there's an issue developing in Conference Room B. Apparently, Captain Chen is meeting with some officers from the 3rd Battalion, and Colonel Richardson has some concerns about the discussions." Webb looked up from his papers, immediately alert. Colonel James Richardson commanded the 3rd Battalion and was known for his traditionalist views and resistance to change. If Richardson was objecting to Sarah's protocols, it could signal broader resistance throughout the command structure. What kind of concerns?" Webb asked, standing up and reaching for his uniform jacket. "I'm not entirely sure, sir." Major Stevens from the 3rd Battalion requested that senior personnel be notified about the meeting, but he wouldn't specify the nature of the problem. Webb felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. Sarah had been careful to follow proper procedures for all of her meetings and briefings, but Richardson was known for finding fault with anything that challenged his preferred way of doing business. The combination of his resistance to change and Sarah's youth and rank could create exactly the kind of conflict that might derail the entire program. As Webb made his way toward Conference Room B, he encountered other senior officers moving in the same direction. Colonel Santos looked concerned, and Lieutenant Colonel Park appeared to be trying to piece together information from various sources. The fact that multiple senior officers were converging on the same location suggested that whatever was happening had the potential for significant consequences. Webb arrived at the conference room to find a crowd of officers in the hallway outside. Through the partially open door, he could hear raised voices, with Richardson's distinctive baritone dominating the conversation. Sarah's voice was also audible, calm but firm, though he couldn't make out her specific words. Major Stevens approached Webb with obvious relief. "Colonel, thank you for coming. The situation has become quite tense, and I thought senior personnel should be aware of what's developing." "What exactly is the situation?" Webb asked, though he was already beginning to piece together the likely scenario. "Captain Chen called a meeting to discuss implementing the new protocols with some of our junior officers. Colonel Richardson arrived unexpectedly and began questioning her authority to make changes to battalion procedures. The discussion has become increasingly heated." Webb nodded grimly. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that everyone had been hoping to avoid during the transition period. Richardson's reputation for protecting his traditional command prerogatives was well established, and his reaction to being asked to adapt to Sarah's protocols was entirely predictable. Through the door, Webb could hear Richardson's voice rising. "Captain, I don't care what authority you think you have. I've been commanding troops since before you were born, and I'm not about to start taking orders from someone who's barely old enough to vote." Sarah's response was measured but clear. "Colonel Richardson, I'm not giving you orders. I'm implementing protocols that have been approved by General Morrison and the Department of Defense. My authority in this matter comes directly from the commanding general. Your authority," Richardson shot back, "comes from some fancy presentation and political connections. Real authority comes from experience, from understanding what it means to lead troops in actual combat situations." Webb exchanged glances with Colonel Santos, who had arrived just behind him.
Both of them recognized that the confrontation was escalating beyond simple disagreement about procedures. Richardson was challenging not just Sarah's protocols, but her fundamental right to hold the position she had been assigned. Lieutenant Colonel Park pushed past them into the conference room, apparently deciding that senior intervention was necessary. Webb followed, with Santos close behind. As they entered, they found Richardson standing over Sarah, who remained seated at the conference table. Several junior officers from the 3rd Battalion sat around the table looking extremely uncomfortable, caught between their immediate commander and the officer who had been tasked with implementing new service-wide procedures. Richardson turned as the senior officers entered. "Good. Maybe now we can get some sanity restored to this situation. This captain thinks she can waltz in here and reorganize how my battalion operates based on some theoretical nonsense she developed in graduate school." Sarah stood up, her movement deliberate and controlled. Webb noticed that her posture remained completely professional despite the obvious stress of the situation. "Colonel Richardson, with respect, the protocols I'm implementing have been tested extensively and approved at the highest levels of command. They're not theoretical and they're not optional." "Don't lecture me about respect, Captain," Richardson replied, his voice growing louder. "I've earned my position through years of service and proven leadership."
You've earned yours through academic achievement and political maneuvering. The accusation hit the room like a physical blow.
Webb saw Sarah's jaw tighten slightly, but her voice remained steady when she responded.
"Colonel, my qualifications and the basis for my appointment are matters of record. If you have concerns about the implementation of these protocols, I'm happy to address them through proper channels." Richardson stepped closer to Sarah, his intention clearly to intimidate through physical presence. "Proper channels? You want to talk about proper channels?" Proper channels would involve experienced officers making decisions about military operations, not allowing children to play with organizational charts. Webb felt his own anger rising. Regardless of any disagreements about protocols or authority, Richardson's behavior was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. The personal attacks and intimidation tactics were unprofessional and potentially damaging to unit cohesion. "Colonel Richardson," Park interjected, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting." "No," Richardson replied firmly. "We should finish this discussion right here and now. I want these young officers to understand what real military leadership looks like." With that statement, Richardson made a move that stunned everyone in the room. He stepped forward aggressively, reaching towards Sarah as if to physically remove her from her position at the head of the conference table. His intention was clearly to demonstrate his authority through physical dominance, to show the junior officers that rank and experience trumped whatever official authorization Sarah might possess. Webb reacted instinctively, stepping forward to intercept Richardson's advance. "Colonel, that's enough." But before anyone could intervene, the conference room door opened, and General Morrison entered with her aide-de-camp. Morrison's eyes immediately took in the scene. Richardson in an aggressive posture, Sarah standing her ground with professional composure, and several senior officers arrayed around the room with expressions of concern and anger. "What exactly is happening here?" Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Richardson immediately straightened, though his face remained flushed with anger. "General, I was expressing my concerns about the appropriateness of having junior officers override the decisions of experienced commanders." Morrison's eyes moved to Sarah, who remained standing but had not moved from her position. "Captain Chen, please explain the situation from your perspective." Sarah's voice was calm and precise. "General, I was briefing officers from the 3rd Battalion on protocol implementation procedures when Colonel Richardson arrived and began questioning my authority to implement the approved procedures. The discussion became heated, and Colonel Richardson was about to physically remove me from the meeting when you arrived." Morrison's expression became very cold. "Colonel Richardson, is Captain Chen's description accurate?" Richardson's face grew even redder. "General, I was simply trying to restore proper order to a situation where military hierarchy was being ignored." "I see," Morrison replied, her tone suggesting that she was seeing considerably more than Richardson might prefer. "And your solution to this perceived problem was to physically intimidate a junior officer who was carrying out direct orders from the commanding general."
The question hung in the air like a challenge. Webb watched Richardson's face as he realized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable.
Morrison's phrasing made it clear that she viewed his actions as insubordination rather than legitimate command concerns. "General," Richardson began. "I was simply—" Morrison raised her hand, cutting him off. "Colonel Richardson, You will report to my office immediately for a private discussion about appropriate conduct and chain of command. This meeting is concluded." Richardson looked around the room, clearly hoping for support from the other senior officers present. Webb found himself torn between sympathy for a colleague and disapproval of Richardson's methods. Colonel Santos looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Park was studying his shoes with obvious embarrassment. As Richardson left the room, Morrison turned to address the remaining officers. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me be absolutely clear about something. Captain Chen is implementing these protocols under direct orders from the Department of Defense, with my complete support and authorization. Her age and rank are irrelevant to the authority she has been granted for this specific mission." Sarah remained standing at attention throughout Morrison's statement, but Webb could see the relief in her eyes. The General's intervention had not only ended the immediate confrontation, but had also established clear boundaries for future interactions. Morrison continued, "Furthermore, I want everyone to understand that the protocols Captain Chen has developed represent the future of military operations. They have been tested, approved, and ordered for implementation. Any officer who cannot adapt to these changes will find themselves reassigned to positions where adaptation is not required." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Officers who continued to resist the new protocols would find their careers limited to positions with minimal responsibility and advancement potential. Webb found himself speaking up. "General, I think I speak for all the senior officers present when I say that we're committed to making this transition successful. Captain Chen has demonstrated both the technical competence and the leadership skills necessary for this role." Sarah looked at him with surprise and obvious gratitude. Morrison nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you, Marcus. I was hoping to hear exactly that kind of support from the senior staff." Morrison paused, then addressed Sarah directly. "Captain, how do you want to proceed with the 3rd Battalion implementation?" Sarah's response demonstrated the diplomatic skills that Webb had come to admire. "General, I think it would be appropriate to schedule a series of smaller meetings with individual companies rather than trying to implement battalion-wide changes all at once. This will allow for more detailed discussion of concerns and more gradual adaptation to the new procedures." Morrison smiled slightly. "An excellent approach, Captain. Please coordinate with Colonel Webb to ensure that the implementation proceeds smoothly." As Morrison left the conference room, Webb found himself alone with Sarah and the junior officers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone uncertain about how to proceed after such a dramatic clash between senior commanders. Sarah addressed the junior officers first. "Gentlemen, I want to apologize for the disruption to our meeting. I hope you understand that the protocols we're implementing are designed to improve operational effectiveness for everyone, regardless of rank or experience level." The officers nodded, clearly impressed by her professionalism in handling such a difficult situation. As they filed out of the conference room, Webb remained behind to speak with Sarah privately. "Captain," he began, "I want you to know that Richardson's behavior doesn't represent the views of the senior staff. Most of us recognize the value of what you're trying to accomplish." Sarah nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Colonel. I have to admit that was more challenging than I expected. I knew there would be resistance to the protocols, but I didn't anticipate such personal animosity." Webb considered his words carefully. "Sarah, if I may call you that in private, you have to understand that for officers like Richardson, these changes represent more than just new procedures. They challenge fundamental assumptions about how the military should work, about what qualifies someone for leadership, about the relationship between experience and authority." "I do understand that," Sarah replied. "That's why I've tried to be so careful about implementation procedures and respecting existing command structures wherever possible."